Hello. On behalf of everyone who has worked to make today's discussion possible, welcome to the California briefing on 25 years of Hispanic serving institutions. My name is Sarita Brown, and I serve as president of Excelencia in Education. Our mission is to accelerate Latino student success in higher education. Meeting our mission makes communities stronger and enriches our country with college-educated talent for the workforce and civic leadership. At Excelencia, we do our work through the use of data. We do our work with a focus on effective practice, and we do our work in partnership with educational leaders across the country committed to making their institutions learning environments where Latino students and all their students thrive. Excelencia is in California virtually today to share our important research about Hispanic serving institutions, emerging HSIs, and the role of higher education in serving Latino students while serving all students. And we're here because of the efforts and commitments of leaders in California. They are the California State University at Northridge, California Community Colleges, California State University, California State University Channel Island, California State University Fresno, California State University Monterey Bay, California State University San Bernardino, and the University of California, Merced. All of these entities and leaders have come together to engage purposefully in today's discussion. It is now my distinct honor to introduce the newest senator from the great state of California, Senator Alex Padilla. Please join today's conversation.
Good morning to my fellow Californians. I'm Alex Padilla, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the California briefing on 25 years of Hispanic serving institutions. By participating today, you are demonstrating your commitment to being very intentional in how we serve Latino students. So I thank you. And thank you to Excelencia in Education for leading the national charge in identifying and promoting proven best practices that accelerate Latino student success. And to the California Community Colleges and the California State University system, and my wife Angela's alma mater, Cal State Northridge specifically, thank you for locking arms in support of this mission and implementing the strategies that make a big difference for students. California is a leader in so many ways, and this is especially true in education. California is home to the most Hispanic serving institutions in the country. The academic leaders speaking today embody the opportunities made possible through quality public education. CSU Chancellor Joseph Castro and California Community Colleges Chancellor Eloy Oakley know firsthand the tremendous potential that focused service to Latino students yields. I want to share a special shout out to CSUN President Erika Beck, our host for this event. More than half of CSUN's undergraduate students are Latino, and they lead the state. They're fourth nationally in baccalaureate degree attainment for Latino students. Now, I grew up in the community of Pacoima in the heart of the San Fernando Valley, which is still my home, so I'm particularly proud of CSUN. Like so many California Community College and Cal State University students, I am a proud child of immigrants. My parents came to this country from Mexico with only elementary school educations, but they were determined to provide a better life for my sister, my brother, and myself. My dad worked as a short order cook at many diners in the area. My mom spent years cleaning houses. And growing up, they told my sister, my brother, and I that the key to a good and better future was getting a good education. This is a value that I hold deeply to this day. And I know my family's not alone. Millions of Latinos are pursuing their American dream. Turning those dreams into reality will be critical to the future of California and for the nation. Our friends at Excelencia in Education will share that for the U.S. to regain top ranking in the world for college degree attainment, Latinos will need to earn more than 6 million degrees by the year 2030. And since California has the largest Latino population in the country, we're counting on you, all of you, to help California and our nation achieve this mark. It's imperative that we close the graduation equity gaps that remain among our underserved student populations. Today's briefing is a reminder of our collective call to action. And you have my pledge to be a committed partner in our nation's capital. To support a highly educated workforce for the country, develop future civic leadership, and build a more inclusive democracy, we must ensure that Latino students thrive. Again, my thanks to Excelencia in Education for your leadership, to all of our HSI partners in this important work, and to our business and industry allies here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Thank you for your words of support and for your partnership and representation for California and so many across the country who want and value a quality education. I want to pivot a little bit and share some of those data that Sarita mentioned in her initial comments about Latino student success overall. So if I could share my screen and look at the role of HSI specifically, I'd like to do that now. So what do we know about HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions? I'll give you a little bit of background and then get to what we see and setting the context for the action we need to take. So HSIs was a definition, a construct created in the 1980s, but was codified in federal legislation in the early 1990s. And the definition of Hispanic Serving Institution in federal legislation says 25% or more undergraduate Hispanic enrollment for public, private, not-for-profit degree granting institutions. It's a mouthful, right? But when you take a look at this, the reason that these institutions were identified as such, based on enrollment, not necessarily mission to serve, is because at the federal level, there was a Higher Education Act that had two areas of focus in investing in institutions that had a high concentration of Hispanic enrollment. And they wanted to help Hispanic serving institutions expand educational opportunities for and improve the attainment of a college education for Hispanic and other low-income students. Second, they wanted to expand and enhance the academic offerings, the program quality, and institutional stability at Hispanic serving institutions. We know over these last 25 years of funding HSIs, that there have been over 270 grants made to HSIs in California specifically, totaling over $637 million. So a little bit of a kind of a summary of what HSIs are. There are 539 institutions that meet that enrollment definition that I just mentioned to you. They represent less than 20% of institutions in this country, but they enroll more than 65% of all Hispanic students, undergraduates enrolled today. They actually graduate in that number as well. Now, they're much more likely to be public. About 70% of HSIs are public institutions. And over the last 5 years, they've reverted to being a little bit more likely to be 4-year institutions than 2-year institutions. And this is the institutions themselves. So what have we seen over the last 25 years? There's been significant growth in the number of institutions that hit that enrollment threshold of 25% or more. And the first time we took a look at this 25 years ago, there were 189 institutions that met that enrollment threshold. And as we shared already, 539 that are at that 25% or more. And that's been a doubling, more than a doubling over the last 25 years. And that really tracks the trend we've seen in the growth of the Latino college age population and college going population. That number of students has tripled over these last 25 years. And so we see this concentrated enrollment and growth happening concurrently. Now, this is not just a dynamic set of institutions that are in the institutions in these states. We assume always California, Texas, New York, Florida, and Puerto Rico. 27 states, and including DC and Puerto Rico, have Hispanic serving institutions. And those numbers are expected to grow as we take a look at emerging HSIs, those institutions that have 15 to 24.9%. That number is at over 300. So we're talking about close to 900 institutions that can hit that enrollment threshold within the next 10 years. And we're looking specifically at California. So in California, California is number one in so many ways. But certainly when we look at the number of HSIs, by far, California has the most institutions that meet that enrollment threshold, 176. They also have the largest number of emerging HSIs at 46. And they also have the most institutions that have a graduate program, HSIs with a graduate program. And all of those speak well. And I will say we're going to look a little more specifically at California now in HSIs. The number of HSIs in California over these last 25 years has grown significantly, over 300%. When we took a look back in 1995, there were 40 institutions that met that enrollment threshold of 25% or more. And today, as we see, there are 176. Those 176 institutions, they represent slightly less than half of all institutions in the state of California, but they enroll almost 90% of all Latino undergraduates in California, and they actually graduate that percent as well. So what we see are that a smaller number of institutions disproportionately enroll and graduate the Latino students in the state. Of them, over 75% are public institutions, and over half, almost 60%, are two-year institutions. That gives you a little bit of a profile. Let's dig a little bit deeper in what we see in some of these data as well about enrollment and completion. So interestingly, California colleges are not among the top 5 in the nation for enrollment, as we find in Florida and Texas, despite being the largest state and having the largest number of Hispanics. However, we do see that there are 3 California colleges that are among the top 5 in awarding baccalaureate degrees in the nation. So in there you will see Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Northridge, and Cal State Long Beach are top 5 in the nation in awarding baccalaureate degrees to Latinos in the nation. The other thing is when we took a look specifically in California, we noticed that all of the top colleges that are awarding degrees in California are public institutions, public 2-year and public 4-year. And we took a look at overall enrollment and Hispanic enrollment and the percent to get a sense of what does that mean when we think about the growth, the potential of the value and contributions these institutions are making to the state and to the country. We also want to take a look at what measures we use to understand this a little bit deeper than just enrollment numbers and completion numbers in a given year. So we took a look at what we call completion rates. This comes from the National Student Clearinghouse, and saw not just looking at graduation rates, but there are still equity gaps in progress and outcomes for Latino students in California compared to our white peers and colleagues. And at Excelencia, our focus is making sure that everybody increases, but while we're doing that, that Latino students accelerate success so that we can close gaps that we see in attainment. And when we look at these data, we know that graduation rates capture first-time, full-time freshmen, which doesn't completely capture the story of what many HSIs are doing that have a high concentration of students who might be part-time, stopping out, swirling, or returning students. So we take a look at these larger numbers as well. And while you see there are gaps in graduation rates, we see that the percentage of students who are still enrolled at 2-year institutions is significantly higher. And unfortunately, we see that the numbers who are no longer enrolled at 2-year institutions also relatively high. whether that's 2-year or 4-year institutions. And that's important as we think about what are constructive measures of looking at institutional effort that aren't just about traditional students, traditional institutions, and traditional pathways. So I shared with you a little bit of numbers to set the tone and the context. We also know we have to pay attention, not just data, but what are we doing to make sure that our students are being successful. And what I share with you, we have a lot more than this. We have of evidence-based practices that are working for Latino students, not just Latino students, but amongst all served. We can see Latinos are doing as well as, or maybe even a little better than others. And for us, this is an opportunity to figure out how do we take those data to action, and what are institutions taking responsibility and committing to make sure our students are served well. And when you see, these are just a sample of the many programs and strategies in place at institutions across the state of California, working to make a difference and to positively influence the success and the quality of the education our students receive in these institutions. Now, Excelencia, we're a relatively small organization working at the national level. And when we shared with you earlier that the fact that there are almost 900 institutions that either are HSIs or emerging HSIs to get there, what struck us is that, because the definition of an HSI is predicated on enrollment, that the commitment, the mission to serve, to do more than just enroll, is an opportunity we have to frame the issue in the context of HSIs. We know that there are some institutions that hit that enrollment threshold because of demography and geography, and not because of intentionality and impact. And part of what we want to do is to make sure that institutions are showing with intentionality that they are having a positive impact on the students they serve overall, and certainly making sure that our Latino students are included in that. And so what we did is we created one framework that we thought, after 20+ years of listening to institutional leaders and staff and faculty and students, that can maybe create a framework for understanding what it means to serve, intentionally serve students. And we know it involves data, it involves practice, and it involves leadership. And so the Seal of Excelencia is one approach, our approach, to try to better understand what it means to intentionally serve students and not just enroll them. And we take a look at all of those elements in our framework to better understand how to distinguish those that are making a constructive, positive, and intentional difference in serving the students that they have. And we know that we are in the second year of the Seal of Excelencia, and 3 institutions in the state of California that have applied for certification and have received the Seal of Excelencia. California State University Channel Islands, which in our inaugural year earned the Seal of Excelencia, and Sacramento State University, which earned it, and Long Beach City College in our second cohort, second year of having the Seal of Excelencia. These are institutions that have significant impact in their data, in their practice, and their leadership. And they have committed to being institutions where Latino and other students can thrive. And that is significant for us as we look to understanding what it takes to address equity and make sure we're serving our students well. Gave you a little bit of context. We're going to be talking to some of our colleagues, but thinking about the descriptive data we shared, as well as practices and a way of being intentional in serving, those are all ways for us to think about how can this information help inform as California moves so forward overall, and as we think about the opportunities we have to better serve our students. That I'm going to stop my screen. Hopefully I've given you some context for understanding a little bit about Hispanic serving institutions. I'd like to see if I could invite President Beck to join us, because President Beck, Erika Beck, she is a proud member of the Presidents for Latino Student Success Network, and she led the first institution in the state of California to earn the Seal of Excelencia when she was head of Cal State University Channel Islands. President Beck.
Well, thank you, Deborah, and thanks for sharing that rich data set. It's an extraordinary way to start the conversation. And it's such an honor to gather with all of you this morning and share this virtual space with colleagues across California and allies across the nation bound by a common cause. The commitment to leading and supporting institutions of higher learning that are fundamentally rooted in opportunity, equity, and inclusion in service of the communities that I know we are all so proud to serve, but also a really clear understanding that in order to realize those foundational values, we need to serve our Latinx students with courageous leadership and, as Deborah mentioned, intentionality. And I think that the imperative for our work is underscored by this particular moment in time as we navigate multiple intersecting crises that have highlighted the historic and persistent inequities in our communities of color across multiple dimensions, including higher education. And so while the road ahead for all of us is replete with challenges, it's also full of promise, because higher education is the answer to so much of what ails us. Our work will propel the future of California's innovation economy and drive economic recovery. Our work will continue to disrupt intergenerational inequity and facilitate human potential while advancing knowledge that serves the public good. And our work will continue to serve as the bedrock of our democratic republic while we nurture the development of future leaders who stand ready to advance a more equitable future for all of us. So it seems to me that our call in this moment and in this discussion is clear. The intentional alignment of our values with our strategic priorities, and it compels us to reject the notion that equity gaps of any kind are acceptable at any level, and to embrace the idea that by working together, all of us here today and across the state of California and the nation, working together and committing to evidence-based decision-making so that we can eliminate equity gaps in perpetuity. One theme that will emerge in this discussion this morning is a commitment to grounding our work in data. And you've already heard Deborah and Sarita expand upon this point. I suspect you will hear a similar refrain from our chancellors in this regard, including the incredible success of the Graduation Initiative 2025 efforts across all 23 CSU campuses. You will also hear it from both of our funding partners, Jeff Green and Peter Taylor, who are similarly focused on evidence-based practices that shift the conversation from philanthropic engagement that feels good to philanthropic engagement that enacts good and advances key strategic priorities and measures tangible outcomes. And all of my colleagues who are here with us today that lead individual institutions, we also know that intentional leadership at the campus level necessitates broad access to data as well. Data that is both actionable, but also data that is discernible to those who are not quantitatively inclined, but that also allows our faculty and staff to sow the seeds of change. I say often that we know that administrative barriers to student success are real, and students have no agency to remove them. So when we can illuminate those barriers, we can remove them. And when we are intentional in our efforts and measure impact, we can scale what works and sunset what does not. So as I was reflecting upon this conversation today and the idea of intentionality in this space, I also realized that leading with intentionality has allowed me to expand and develop my own equity-mindedness. And it's led me to ask critical questions about policies and practices through an equity lens, ensuring that my teams and I are working towards developing programs, systems, and structures that are student ready, rather than focusing on whether all of our students are college ready. And I think at the heart of it, we're shifting the conversation from what a student does or does not do to what our institution must do to support our students in realizing their highest educational aspirations. When I first became engaged in this work a couple of decades ago, I often remarked that we didn't have a roadmap that could tell us how to eliminate the equity gaps. We didn't have the magical GPS that we all have in our hands and our cars that could navigate us towards our intended destination. We were really forging the path in real time, staying close to the data and adjusting along the way as we learned more about what worked and what did not. But now, thanks to our collective efforts across California and the nation, that's just no longer true. Deborah just presented us with an incredibly robust data set, 25 years of information, and collectively we have a wealth of intellectual capital emanating from across the nation, many of whom are joining us today for this conversation. So I think for me, it's clear that Excelencia has given us the roadmap that we needed. The Seal of Excelencia and examples of Excelencia, which include evidence-based practices that not only work, as Deborah indicated, but they come from every shape, size, and iteration of Hispanic serving institution across the country. So if we're to reach our intended destination where equity gaps are a relic of the past, we're going to need to harness distributed leadership and intentionality throughout and across institutions. And I will tell you that as the president of an HSI, as Deborah indicated, I adopted the Seal of Excelencia framework, data, practice, and leadership. And I witnessed the transformation that occurs when strategic priorities are operationalized and aligned across every corner of the university, and silos begin to melt away. And we realized historic gains in retention and graduation rates and substantive decreases in equity gaps. And it was my highest honor during my time as president of Cal State Channel Islands to be recognized as the first university in California to earn that Seal of Excelencia. My other reflection in this conversation is that the culmination of these experiences really helped me to understand that this is not the work of the few, it's the work of us all. It can't solely be the work of those who hold a title that include the words student success, equity, or diversity. And it's not the work of our faculty and staff of color who continue to carry the very heavy burden of cultural taxation. And it's not the work of a single institution, system, or state. It takes all of us. So in that vein, I look forward to watching the dialogue continue to unfold this morning. I thank all of my colleagues across California and beyond for your commitment and partnership in accelerating Latinx student success, which accelerates the success of all of our students, but it also accelerates the success of our communities and our country. So with that, Deborah, I will turn the floor back over to you.
Thank you, President Beck. I appreciate that. And there's so many opportunities for reflection about what the data do and don't tell us, more importantly, who it is we're trying to serve. And I appreciate your thoughts and reflections and your leadership as you've made that commitment in your role overall and with the team that joins you. I'd like to see if we could have our colleagues and introduce our Chancellor of the California State University System, Joseph Castro, who's joining me, as well as the Chancellor for the California Community College System, Eloy Oakley, to join me. We want to have a little bit of a conversation. You all are leading a significant role in California, but in the country, and looking at institutions that are making a difference. And you both have a significant number of Hispanic serving institutions that are in your systems. Now, I also know that many of the practices we put on our screen came from the institutions that work with you and that you are responsible for guiding, leading, supporting, and engaging. So I wanted to start by asking you all if you would share with us in a very complex way. There's so many things that you are doing. If you could start off just one thing that you believe you're doing, that one strategy, one investment that is making a significant difference for your Latinx students and others in California that you think others could replicate. Of the many things you're doing, what would you pick? I'll start with you, Chancellor Castro.
Great. Good morning. And thank you, Deborah and Sarita, for inviting me to join you today. And I was so happy to listen to President Beck talk about her successes at Channel Islands. And I know that Northridge is going to continue to rise under her leadership. Well, I think this is a story of great progress as it relates to Latino students in the CSU. And yet we know there's so much more work to do. And I would say, at least I want to celebrate for a minute the progress that we've made. Over the last decade, the number of Latino students in the CSU has increased by about 60% and is now at about 200,000 students and headed toward majority of our CSU system. About 21 of our 23 campuses are HSIs. And I would love to get, I think number 22 is right knocking on the door. And I'm gonna get 23 moved along so that we have all 23 as HSIs. And I'd love to have them be get the seal as well of Excelencia. I think that's an incredible accomplishment. I'd love to see that scaled across our system. And if I were to pick out one particular initiative that has fueled that progress, I would say it's our Graduation Initiative 2025, where we've invested about $250 million since 2017. And that has, I think, propelled a lot of innovation on the campuses. And you heard about that at Channel Islands. And I saw some of the examples that you had in your own slide there, Deborah, and there are a myriad other examples. And so we have made great progress in terms of graduation rates. We have much more work to do, but the four-year graduation rate has risen from 14% to 25% just in the last 5-6 years. The 6-year rate hasn't increased as much, but it's gone to almost 58%. And I know our transfer rates have been increasing too. And I just want to shout out to Chancellor Oakley for all the hard work that he's done with the community colleges, because actually a majority of our students now are community college transfer students, and they're doing very well in the CSU. So I think if I were to pick out one initiative, Deborah, it would be that one, because there's been a framework with goals around graduation rates and, of course, eliminating the equity gaps. And that has allowed each campus to develop individualized strategies that work well for their campus and to learn from each other as part of this system. And yet those equity gaps, and we probably want to talk more about that in a little bit, but those equity gaps have continued to be stubborn, and be happy to address those later as you wish.
Great. No, thank you. I appreciate that. We always want to start about the opportunities and things that are going well, and having such a big initiative that captures so much is critical. Already you gave a shout out to Chancellor Oakley for their hard work in making sure their students are prepared and can transfer in. But I'd ask you the same question, Chancellor Oakley, of the many things, and we know there's so many things that are going on in your institutions are making a positive difference that other institutions can learn from. But if you had to pick one strategy or initiative, what would you start us off in thinking about?
Sure. Well, thank you, Deborah. And as Joe mentioned, it's great to be with you and with Excelencia. I would say I'll give a broad perspective and then a specific example. The broad perspective, much like what Chancellor Castro mentioned, it begins with intentionality. Intentionality is the most important part of this, and which is why the seal is so important. We cannot just be satisfied being Hispanic serving institutions. We have to strive to be Hispanic graduating institutions. And so we have to go beyond just the recognition that we have many Latinx students. So that intentionality is the most important part, and is what we've tried to infuse into the California community colleges. And then a specific example, I think, would be the changes we've made in the elimination of standardized placement exams and changing the placement practices, and essentially beginning to eliminate the use of remedial education. That has been the greatest positive impact for students of color, and particularly Latinx students. So, we are acknowledging the talent that our students come to community college with, replacing them in transfer level courses, providing them co-requisites and other support structures. And guess what? They are succeeding in numbers equal to or better than students that began in remedial education. So that is one specific example of a practice, a policy change with intentionality. And I think it's proven to be very effective, and it's helping our students get ready to go to Joe's campuses.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Great way to start off with the things that we know are working. Others can replicate as well. This is not unique to California. But in that same vein, there have been some increasing challenges, certainly not the least of which is the pandemic we're still going through, and the acknowledgement publicly of what so many of us have known about the systemic inequities that preceded us, but that continue to exacerbate the opportunities that so many of our students of color and students in California have. So, if you were to think about some of the challenges that you're facing to try and meet that goal, and Chancellor Castro, you mentioned specifically, as we did, the equity gaps and the opportunity to address them. What are some of the challenges that you're having to confront in your leadership role to make sure that we can fulfill the promise that our students have when they enroll at our institutions?
Thank you. I firmly believe that talent exists in every household. And our job is to try to figure out how we can unleash that talent to prepare a new generation of leaders. And yet, we also know that the headwinds have been very strong. The inequities that have been discussed earlier have persisted and been exacerbated by the pandemic. So I want to acknowledge that, because I hear about that and I see it so clearly right now, what our students are going through, many of them, and their families. The fact that the pandemic has affected families of color much differently, because so many of them are essential workers and many have lost their jobs. Some are trying to get new jobs and putting themselves, at risk to make a few dollars. And that's in addition to the inequities that we know have existed. I come from the San Joaquin Valley, and my experience at Fresno State, has really shaped my thinking and my own lived experiences, growing up in public housing as a son of a single mother and seeing the challenges that so many of our students face. 1/5 of the students in the leading feeder school to Fresno State, the leading feeder district, Fresno Unified School District, 1/5 of those students lived in public housing. And that just gives you a sense of the income inequality that exists. So I'm very concerned about the financial aspects. We're seeing it in terms of food and housing insecurity, technology challenges right now that have been stubborn, and healthcare access, of course, and then the education inequality that we know, the unevenness, so that some students have a longer road to travel than others when they get to Eloy and to me, and yet we need to lean into that. And so one of the things I've done in my first days as chancellor is to put a new group together to look at these equity gaps with a new eye and a way to accelerate the elimination of those gaps over the next 4 years. And we're going to look at all different strategies, and as President Beck said, retire some that aren't working as well, and invest in some new ones as needed, and invest more in the ones that are working well. So those are some of the things that I'm concerned about. And as I think about what Peter and Jeff might say, we need to figure out a way to accelerate more opportunities for our students to get internships and other experiences that help them get ready for a successful career, so that they're getting their degree, but they're also getting some real world experiences that help them better compete after they've achieved their degree and can be successful in the workforce.
That's significantly important, since so many of your students are also the first in their family to go to college.
Absolutely.
So that social and economic network of opportunity has to be there, right? That's
Yeah,
so
well,
cool.
about 80% of our Latino students are first generation of college.
That's significant. Thank you, Chancellor. In that same vein, we often talk about community colleges, often underfunded, as many are, but finding ways, and that's not to mean that resources aren't significant, but you face a lot of challenges with the number of institutions you have and trying to find ways to serve your students well. So can you share with us just some of the challenges that you faced in your leadership role and how you're trying to address that?
Well, certainly the last 18 months or so have been a particular challenge. I mean, we were challenged before the pandemic. We were living in an era where we had an administration attacking the students that we serve. We had record amounts of housing insecurity and food insecurity in our system. And then, of course, 2020 happened, and that exacerbated everything. Many of our students have children, have families to support, lost jobs, lost hours, or were frontline workers, sacrificing everything to support us. So our students, and this is true across the country, are some of the most under-resourced students in all of higher education, and our colleges are some of the most under-resourced. So what we've done is we have pushed very hard on Congress to provide direct support, to consider funding that support on the basis of headcount, not just FTES, which is our primary students because many of them work, they go part-time. We've raised significant amounts of money. We raised from the J. Pritzker Foundation $100 million to go to some of the most under-resourced communities within the community college system. And we've gotten support from Governor Newsom and the legislature in the last budget package to provide $100 million of direct emergency aid to our students. So we've been sounding the alarm. We've been doing everything we can internally to provide direct support. And we've been advocating both at the federal level and at the state level to recognize that if we are going to have a recovery with equity, we have to provide support for those who are least resourced in the higher education systems.
Yeah, I often find that that's a challenge for people who don't understand what equity fundamentally means, where I think they often conflate it with diversity and inclusion, also very important goals, but not the same as equity and looking at the systemic inequities. You spoke of recovery with equity. I was honored to be a part of Governor Newsom's task force on recovery with equity, and made me think as I was reflecting on this conversation about HSIs that there are a lot of opportunities and challenges both in the work you all are doing in the leadership with so many faculty and staff, as well as the students who are all trying to come together. And it sometimes feels like we can be cross purposes, our goals are not the same, but if you take this specific construct that is HSIs and this idea that we're trying to bring attention to about being intentional and serving and the work you're doing, what are the opportunities that we see for recovery with equity where you would place specifically, in this case, I'll start with you, Chancellor Oakley, community colleges front and center. Can we have recovery with equity without the effort and of your faculty and your staff and your students to make California recover in such a way that we lead the country in what needs to happen?
So no disrespect to any of my four-year university colleagues, but I believe in this particular moment in time with this particular crisis, community colleges have to be front and center because they are closest to the people, the families, and the communities that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic and the economic fallout. And if we want to see a recovery, particularly a recovery back to livable wage paying jobs, we need to invest in community colleges and we need to invest in the workforce. And again, if we think about those who have been hit hardest, they've been, frontline workers, restaurant workers, they've seen their jobs go away, jobs that may never come back, or at least not anytime soon. So community colleges are the most democratic system of higher education in the country. They serve the top 100%. And so that we have got to lead with community colleges in this recovery.
Right, that's so important. And as we think about this, that's the recovery with equity. We're still in it, though. We're not done, unfortunately, with the challenges. And Chancellor Castro, you lead 23 institutions, all with faculty and staff and students that are committed to cause, otherwise it wouldn't be there. Figuring out what does recovery with equity mean to you as you think about your system and structures? What does that mean?
Well, I think that Eloy is correct in terms of needing to invest in the largest community college system in the country. And I would say also the largest university system in the country, public university, the CSU. I think it's both. And we actually have at this moment a progressive government in Sacramento and what looks to me like a progressive administration in Washington, D.C., both talking about equity, just like we are. And the report that you helped produce, I think, is a powerful roadmap for us. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that there's a recognition of the challenges that we're facing, and that has come with some decisions recently. Over the last few weeks, we received great news about restoring the cut to our budget, and also other investments that the governor wishes to make. I think that's going to help us to make some significant progress here. And my hope is that we can build on that in Sacramento and invest at a higher level, because Eloy is right, the return on investment from an equity perspective is very significant. And then in Washington, we need to get the DREAM Act. We need to double the Pell Grant. Those are things that will make a huge difference in our success here in California. And I think we need to continue to be very aggressive there as well as in Sacramento.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just get one more thought in, because you guys have been so effective in your feedback. And that's thinking, yesterday we had the Secretary of Education was confirmed, Secretary Cardenas, and that there's a voice that California has that is unique because of your size, your role, your leadership in areas like equity, along with a lot of pain points that are involved. And we often talk a lot about money, how and resources, how important that is in helping. But we know it's not just about money. So I'm going to put that aside for a minute. Maybe we'll get back to that in a second. But if there was one thing that you would suggest to the new secretary of what could be done to address this, the national need leading in California, with California, in getting to a nation to recover with equity, what would you recommend the secretary do in his leadership role that could make a difference for our students? I'll start with you, Chancellor Castro.
It's a great question. I would say number one for me is we've got to get the DREAM Act passed.
Okay.
And that affects so many of the students that we serve here in California, both Eloy and I and the UC as well. And it will also open doors for those dreamers who hesitated, and it will, I think, be a powerful signal that equity exists for them. That would be the number one thing on my list. And I know you said no money, but you heard me talk about Pell Grants, and I just would like to see more communication between us and greater partnerships, perhaps more investment in innovative projects that could be scaled nationally, started within our systems and scaled nationally.
That's great. Thank you. That's important, especially since you have the largest number of HSIs, but also so many innovative efforts that you all are putting in place, and the kind of leadership that you saw with the governor's task force and efforts. So that's important. And please don't, not that money doesn't matter and you don't need resources, but I do often know that often that seems like the approach. We know there's so much more going on. So I appreciate partnerships, as you mentioned, as well as making sure that legislation like the DREAM Act or signal the commitment we have to our students overall. Chancellor Oakley, if you had the opportunity, that 30-second elevator pitch to the new Secretary of Education, what would you recommend as a way that we, not just in California, but nationally, can recover with equity?
Well, I've already sent many elevator pitches to the Department of Education. Fortunately, we have several friends in the Department of Education that know us well, and Secretary Cardona will be a great advocate as well. But the first thing I would say is, it is critically important that we get the K-12 schools open, because so many of our students have children, and they need help and support with their children, and so do our faculty and staff. So that is certainly important. But right after that, we have to think about how we invest in reskilling or upskilling so many of the displaced workers that are out there. That has got to be one of the top priorities for this administration, is how do we get people back to work in a meaningful way? Because, if you're hungry, if you're having a hard time paying the rent, education becomes a second, third, and fourth priority. So we've got to take care of some of those initial priorities so that people can exist and can feel that their economic security is in place, so that they can get on with the business of getting back into higher education and completing their educational goals.
Thank you. Yes, embarrassing. I said Cardona instead of Cardona, but thank you for that. I find it very interesting as we think about these issues. You'd mentioned kind of displaced workers, getting them back to work. I can't take credit for this, but I saw a tweet where someone said, how is it that we can be essential workers? Essential workers don't get a livable wage. You can be essential and not have a livable wage. And I think a lot about that as we're talking about what recovery with equity means. And what I'm hearing, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that it is about the educational experience, but it's not just limited to the educational experience, that all these other elements feed into what it takes for our community to, all of our communities to be served well as we go forward.
Yes.
So thank you for that. And in that vein, you know, we've got a lot of work that we've shared kind of nationally, we've shared kind of a statewide, we've shared within your system. For you all as individuals that have to engage with this in your communities, have you thought about what kind of message you would share with your faculty and your staff, those that are within your smaller circle of effort, to show the promise and the opportunity of not just HSIs, but what we're doing in this time and space under our watch? Have you thought about what that, I'm sure you have, what that message can be that you would share with us, that you share with those in that smaller circle, where you have that direct impact? I'll start with you, Chancellor Castro.
Sure. Well, I think for me and for so many people that serve within the CSU, we're here because of the mission and the values, the inspirational mission that we all serve. And, you know, I remember some of my early days in the CSU. I served in the UC and I came to the CSU about 8 years ago. And I remember some of my early days where we actually, I couldn't believe it, but where there were debates about whether we could be an accessible and a successful institution. There were literally debates about that. And we've come such a long way. And I feel like by and large, even though people are very stressed right now during the pandemic for good reason, just reminding them of the mission that we all are guided by, and the importance of the work, the social mobility that has occurred because of the work in the community colleges and the CSU, and frankly, all the higher education institutions in California, that I think we're the lucky ones. We get to be here at this consequential time in history and make a positive difference and try to do better for the students that come in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Chancellor Oakley, from your perspective?
Well, I would say there has never been a time, certainly in my experience in public higher ed, where the value of broad access public education institutions hasn't been greater, hasn't been more valued. We have a president who attended a public university. We have a first lady that still teaches at a community college. We have a country hungry to support, displaced workers and provide opportunity for more Americans. So I think this is the greatest moment for public higher education that we've had in decades. And this is a real opportunity for us to make a difference in the lives of the students that we get up every morning wanting to serve. And so I hope that we don't lose this opportunity, because these kinds of opportunities don't come very often. And while we've lived through a heck of a year, the racial reckoning, the pandemic, the health crisis have all pointed the spotlight on institutions like ours. So I'm very hopeful that we can make a difference.
And that hope is so critical when we see all the opportunities, but also the challenges in front of us. Thank you both for sharing your perspectives as we think about what it means to look at the next 25 years of Hispanic serving institutions and to intentionally serve the students we have and those that we want to be serving going forward. So thank you both so much for your leadership. I'm going to hand it back to you, Sarita.
Many thanks. What a powerful discussion. And it is absolutely invoking that higher education, all of education, is a human enterprise. That last conversation brought to the fore what we know. We are all living through a moment like none of us expected. And the opportunity to rise to that moment is available for all of us. We thought it important to focus on how the students of California are rising to this moment. These images reflect the students, the faculty, the staff of institutions that have come together to be here today, engaged in this conversation. We're using this as a springboard to now look at the broader context with which we have today's conversation. I'd like to introduce two leaders who are invested in higher education, who have acumen and skills and proven track record in the private sector, and I will name them each and invite them into a conversation. Peter Taylor, for many of us, is known primarily as the president of the ECMC Foundation. He is also a trustee of the California State University, and he is a leader in discussions about equity for all. Jeff Green is the CEO and chairman of Trade Desk. He is a philanthropist who has invested his earnings, if you will, from what he's done in the private sector to make the world a better place. Who better to have this conversation today, which is about, for Excelencia, for our partners, the impact of what we've spent the last 45 minutes looking at. What has happened to 25 years of investment by the federal government into an enterprise known as Hispanic-Serving Institutions, California's institutions engaging with that, and what now is a track record, which is the platform for what we will do today and what we can achieve tomorrow. So with that rhetorical setup, I'm going to turn to Peter first and ask you to reflect on what has given California momentum, even in this moment of the pandemic?
You know, I think it's, and thank you, Sarita, for the opportunity to join you today and join great leaders like Joe, Eloy, and Erika. I think it's three things, and none of which can be taken for granted in California or anywhere else. One is funding. Secondly is innovation and creativity. And thirdly is philanthropy. Funding, everybody talks about how important it is, but I think there's no question that 2 of the last 3 years, our governor, our legislature totally stepped up to support public higher education. That makes a huge difference. And frankly, when you look backwards on the issue of innovation, our shift at the CSU to the Graduation Initiative 2025 was no small step. There was huge culture change involved and a fair amount of pushback, I might add, from internal stakeholders to set high standards, and the legislature and the governor, to their credit, funded that initiative. And so the innovation matched with funding meant a lot. But I've worked in the public sector, Sarita, as you know. I was CFO for the University of California during the Great Recession from 2009 to 2014, a brutally difficult time in higher education in terms of funding cuts. And I think one of the things I learned is when risk and innovation are needed the most, it's really hard sometimes in the public sector to do things that are a little bit creative, a little bit outside of the normal. It's very easy to get stuck in what I call paradigm paralysis, meaning we've always done it this way, people haven't complained, it seems to be working okay, when in fact, you need to do something different. And too often in the public sector, public universities, you try something new, it doesn't work, somebody sticks a microphone in your face and says, how dare you waste public resources? And that's where philanthropy can come in. Philanthropy can fund creative initiatives that help give innovative leaders the resources they need to try things new. That kind of culture change is hard, and resources make the difference in terms of enabling that to go forward. So I think California's, if you will, a competitive advantage, Sarita, is really around our commitment to funding, our innovative attitude, and philanthropy, all marrying together to help students succeed.
Thank you, Peter. Jeff, you are a philanthropist. That's a word that is mighty in the circles that we run in. I'm not sure it's always understood by everyone. So I'm going to give you a twofer. Why don't you say a little bit about what philanthropy is? But then also, we are delighted to learn that in your giving, which is fundamentally the characteristic, the action, you use data. Talk about that. Talk about both of those, please.
Yeah, so to me, they both really belong together, and too often they're not put together. So philanthropy is just the effort to take money that you've made, typically in a private sector or in an individual's life, and then put it to work for the general good. And it typically has a much longer horizon in terms of impact, but it doesn't have to. But that is definitely the way that I look at it. My family foundation is actually called Data Philanthropy. And I approach philanthropy the way many venture capitalists approach businesses, which is I'm interested in creating sustainable change. In fact, Erika and I both say something that I think is very similar, which is when I'm talking to nonprofits or to noble causes, are you interested in doing good or feeling good? And if you're interested in doing good, then you cannot be allergic to data, which is to say that we're going to invest in something. We're going to create a hypothesis that we can create greater equality, for instance, in opportunity. And then let's look at the data and see if our actions actually did that. And if we just spend more time creating a hypothesis, testing it, we invest some amount of money, then we can actually achieve what Joe was talking about a little bit earlier, which is let's test some models and then let's get them to scale. But we'll only do that after we see the data that points us in the direction of making those investments.
Well, today's connection is going to be sustaining because you've just sang the song that Excelencia was founded on back in 2004. And in that, let's also be overt and intentional and talk about equity. Because the words of philanthropy, the words of investment, the words of innovation are quite compelling. I'm going to be a little pointed and say, I sit in a lot of conversations with good-meaning people who talk about these things and at some point in a conversation reference equity, but they don't seem to hold themselves accountable. I'm being very provocative right now. They don't seem to hold themselves accountable through the use of data. In your circles, in your work, how do these things hang together? And can you give us specific examples? Peter, I'll go back to you, please.
Sure, boy, lots of examples come to mind. I mean, I think back actually, Sarita, to the time when I was working in investment banking, and I got put in charge of West Coast recruiting and for our banking enterprise, and was told, well, you can come out and interview a bunch of Ivy League kids. And I'm like, well, why would I do that? We've got great colleges and universities on the West Coast. That's because the bank always hired from Ivy Leagues. And by the way, Ivy League graduates who just happen to play lacrosse. Their idea of diversity was lacrosse players from Duke and Johns Hopkins. Pushing the culture change necessary to break through that and be able to show that, in fact, there were terrific students here on the West Coast was part of the culture change. Again, relying on data, facts, evidence to show that our students were just as competitive. When you get to higher education, I think it's imperative for us to really make sure that our resources are being targeted and focused. And again, data, facts, evidence drive that conversation. Our foundation has supported a number of initiatives at the CSU and at the community colleges on everything from young men of color initiatives, basic needs and the like, but always with an expectation that, we learn from that and we see what works. I loved President Beck earlier, who talked about how important it was to retire strategies that don't work. Let me tell you, that's really, really hard. But if you can repurpose those dollars into things that do work based upon evidence, data, and facts, you can really help a lot more young people than you might expect otherwise.
So Jeff, from your experience in giving and looking at data, when and how does this idea of investing in strategies that have traction as it relates to closing equity gaps come in?
Yeah, so let's start with the hypothesis part of this, and I just want to share part of my vision and hypothesis before I talk about the data that goes into it. So maybe my favorite movie of all time is It's a Wonderful Life, and there's this scene where George Bailey, of course, the character's name played by James Stewart, is defending the everyday citizens of Bedford Falls. And he says, these people do most of the living and working and paying and dying in this town. Isn't it? And is it too much to ask them live and pay and work and die in a good bedroom and a good bath? And I would apply the same thing to education, which is how many people on this call wish they had less education? Right. And I imagine that the answer is zero. None of us wish we had less education. But when we're thinking about the masses, the way that George Bailey was, I often think that those are the ones that we don't think of. We might think of the edges, and you look at the endowment funds that Peter was just talking about at the Ivy Leagues, or some of the most premier universities in the country, that their endowment funds are massive. But often what gets overlooked are those at the top of the bell curve, like the biggest university in the United States, that is Cal State, this Cal State program. That's why I'm interested in being here, because I want to figure out a way to lower the barrier to entry and help more first-time college attendees be first-time college graduates. And that stat that Joe also shared of just how many of our Hispanic population are first-generation college attendees. How do we make that opportunity more accessible? And then in the process, how do we make that so that they're more successful? One way to do that is to get closer, for companies to get closer to the actual students and become more invested. One of the ways that we did that at Cal State Channel Islands with Richard Yao, the president now, as well as with Erika Beck, is to create a peer mentor program where I funded a number of scholarships, and then we just tested the data. How can we influence the outcome? And if we are not increasing the chances of graduation, then let's do something different. Let's adjust the size of every scholarship. Let's look at every piece of data so that we can see what the outcome is. And then as we learn and prove that something works, let's scale it.
Wonderful. And this is totally coincidental, but just yesterday, our team had the opportunity to speak with President Yao about his vision for the time that he has before him, which is what all of us must do on a daily basis. What are we going to do with the day that we have? What are we going to do with the time that we have? And he focused exactly on this, on looking at whatever is available within the campus that indicates not just that these programs exist, but then who are they reaching and what happens when the students receive those scholarships. So Peter, the curating of the feedback loop, because that's the other dimension of philanthropy. You make an investment, you look at its impact, and then when you perhaps see hopefully righteous work, how do you let the greater ecosystem know? Because I will say to you both, we all know that higher education has been criticized severely, and we are saying, all of us, I mean, we didn't even know each other all that well, but we're all saying that higher education is fundamental. So the role of philanthropy at this moment is particularly important. How do you take the, in essence, validation of your investment, particularly as it relates to Latino student success, and make that more public?
And it's so critical, because I think philanthropy is growing into the role of publicizing what they're learning through their grants. 20 years ago, I was on the board of a major foundation here in California who tried a strategy. It didn't work. They wrote something in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and the blowback was, wow, you admitted failure? Well, no, the idea is we don't want anybody else replicating that strategy and also wasting money. Let's learn from what we're doing. And so I think foundations are a lot more proactive now, whether it be information through their websites or through press and media, and also appearing at conferences and convenings of educators, but also partnering with higher education to lead initiatives, to help fund initiatives. We have launched Catalyzing Transfer Initiative with 8 colleges and universities around the country, including Cal State East Bay, to help them think through new ways to do transfer more effectively. We've launched a Basic Needs Initiative with 7 universities around the country to help think about new ways to approach student basic needs. The last thing I will say though, Sarita, and where I think our sector struggles is that conundrum between charity and philanthropy. Last year it really hit home. COVID hits in March, student basic needs just exploded. And so we shifted. We put almost $4 million into just everything from basic needs for housing, checks for food, Wi-Fi, iPads, short-term investments to help keep young students on track. Long-term, though, we're all looking to fix those systemic barriers that take multiple years of investment. And importantly, who are the partners we bring along who, as you said, Sarita, have intentionality and a focus on impact? Doing that and partnering together allows us, I think, to have outsized impact relative to the dollars themselves.
So Jeff, the efforts that you've made to put the worthy investments out there in the world so that people can learn from them, give us a couple of examples.
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about education, and because I believe that creates the foundation for not just healthy lives and the people that we help and fund specifically in potential scholarships or improving the system, but that improvement actually contributes to society. I often think we look at this sort of incorrectly, which is we focus on the education of our own family members, and then everybody else is sort of like every man for himself, if you will. And I just don't, I don't believe in that approach. But any place where there is, I think from a data-driven perspective, an inequity or some sort of obstacle to opportunity are the places where I want to invest the most. So I love the fact that we've had this great testing in our peer mentor program at Cal State Channel Islands. I work with this other nonprofit that is focused on getting education to kids who have cancer. And there's just a unique set of challenges for those kids. And there's 90,000 kids with cancer in America today. And that's a serious obstacle to them having a normal life, despite the fact that they're often treated successfully, but it just creates barriers. So just looking at all of those and then in a data-driven way, saying, how do we scale and how do we know that it's working? And then, to the point that Peter was making, public institutions don't always move really fast. Creating change inside of higher education is really hard. And that is part of the role that philanthropy is playing now at an unprecedented level. And that is to say that we can provide nudges and a level of agility to just fund the things that are the hypotheses that we believe can create results, and then working more closely to implement that change as it comes. But we can be a catalyst for change that, if left alone, the system would just keep doing what it's doing. So when I put all that together, there's a lot going on. I could go down the list and keep telling you more, but there's a couple.
Well, and hopefully this will be the beginning of many conversations, because it's all about making common cause and it's about advancing strategies that yield positive results. I'm going to lean on you both, because the whole reason that Excelencia is here in California today, the reason that we are thrilled to be partnering with President Beck and others, is because the analysis that Deborah conceived in this project, 25 Years of Hispanic-Serving Institutions, is a big one as it relates to a framework for making a case for why the federal government should invest in institutions that enroll larger numbers of Hispanic students. That's how it all began. Now, for you today, having been invited to speak with us today, to look at this analysis, can you give us a touch point? Having heard what you did, having seen the evidence of disinvestment, having heard now that we have a springboard of California's got bragging rights with more HSIs and others, how this is going to touch what you do and how authentically you might be able to share this information with others. Because at Excelencia, we don't want to just produce this analysis, we want it to support the action. And you both are involved in action and investment. So I'm gonna call you and ask you, hopefully you'll have an answer to this. I'm gonna ask you first, Jeff.
Yeah, so I really liked the way Eloy put it earlier in this call, which is, I don't know that there's been a better time for education to be more accessible. Now, let's not let that get in the way of saying we're done. We're not. We have a lot of work to do yet, but we're making progress, and it's because of that investment. I do believe that we're starting to see the importance of making education accessible and then using data all along the way to make certain that we're making wise investments. But I think what the data is showing is that education is as important as it has ever been, and that we need to keep looking at ways to modify our on-ramps so that we make it more accessible, especially for those that historically or their parents never had the opportunity. And it's working. It's generally working. A lot of work to do, but generally working.
Thank you. Peter.
I hope going forward, Sarita, that we can really celebrate our victories. It's so easy to always focus on the things that aren't working. And again, that's a long list. But, Eloy mentioned the changes to remedial education. Absolutely fundamental change that is having a great impact on young people of color, achieving their educational goals and objectives. Let's focus on making sure that some of these innovations we've tried and that have succeeded are fully replicated and fully built out and fully supported. So I'd like to see that going forward. And then, ultimately, education comes down to people. You've got to invest in great leaders. And that sometimes means sucking up and paying a little bit more money than you'd like. But the fact of the matter is, our colleges and universities have budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. You need great leaders to help make sure those funds are appropriately driven towards impact on behalf of our students.
Thank you. Thank you both for these comments. Thank you both for all that you do on a daily basis. And thank you for making common cause in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
When we look at this question of what it is that each of us does and how we can affect change, we've been talking about the macro, and that's where we want to have impact, because this is a significant moment and this is a significant opportunity. Yet change and education happens in a more intimate, more direct, more personal way. It happens within colleges and campuses. It happens between faculty and students. We are so pleased to showcase for you several of the examples of evidence-based practices that are within the colleges and universities that have invested to make today's conversation possible. Let's look together at what real people have been doing and how their strategies can be replicated for all of us to think about as we go forward.
You see, Cal State Northridge has a large population of Hispanic students, underrepresented minorities. Students are often the first in their families to go to college. And I believe that's one of the reasons why Excelencia looked at us as an example. Because every single student has a story. They have a community behind them, and they know that when they leave the program, they will be connected to this community forever.
In my second year here, maybe the Dean of the College of Humanities sent me an email about a new program. The program is known as HSI Pathways. So the whole goal is to pair really promising undergraduate students with mentors. So I was paired with Chantel, who's a linguistics major here. Chantel was just incredible to work with. In every student's life, there are setbacks, but I never once saw one of those setbacks become a stumbling block for her. So she knew how to ask for help, but also how to see that setback as a learning experience to further her own project.
This program in particular, I think what it helped me to prepare for was definitely like kind of research that I wanted to do and what kind of questions that I wanted to ask. I feel like with academia, like there's a bunch of different ways that you could go. I will bring the lessons that my professors have taught me to wherever I may end up.
The AIMS program here at CSUN is really beneficial because of a couple different things. It's tutoring program, it's research program, it's mentoring program, it's faculty mentoring program, and other events that help us connect with our faculty and professors to feel more engaged with the College of Engineering. Without Cal State University Northridge's AIMS program, I don't think I would be able to really strive for the things that I want to set for myself in the future. Hopefully in the future, I'm able to work with somewhere in the aerospace industry, because that is something that really excites me. I'm really excited to see what the future holds for me.
One of the things that I really admire about Sage is Sage has been able to tie what she does in work with what she's studying in the classroom. She's really brought environmental studies into ASI and has made our organization a more sustainable organization. She's worked extremely hard at sharing her knowledge of environmental studies as well as sustainability, not only with our team, but with our campus.
I have the pleasure of working with ASI. I was inspired by some of my peers who had influenced me and said, hey, how do you feel about doing programs? And I had the chance through Jesse to do that interview, and he gave me a chance of a lifetime, as I like to say, because he didn't know it at the time, but that second interview I had to do with him made such a difference in where I would go and how far I've come.
I started at the AIMS program here at CSUN my second year in college. So the primary, aspect of the program that really attracted me was the research. Yeah, I just wanted to be a part of like this increasing network of students just like me, who are in some way needing help to advance in the college. The environment nurtures that kind of mentality, to continuously learn and to continuously work on yourself. And anyone who comes here to CSUN would just feel that positive energy.
Thank you. This is just a sliver of what is the human enterprise, the educational experiences for students that seek admission to colleges and universities who live by a social contract that if you do your part, they will do theirs. That's probably the best way to bring Erika Beck, president of CSUN, to this conversation's close. Join me, please.
Well, thanks, Sarita. What a great conversation today. Extraordinary. So those of you who know me well, and Sarita and Deborah know me pretty well, know that I'm an experimental psychologist by training. And so my heart is singing right now with the focus on data, evidence, and impact. So I just really appreciate all of the speakers who joined us this morning, and all of our colleagues who commit to this work every day. But I also want to thank you and Deborah and everybody at Excelencia for your critical leadership. I know that working with all of you has really transformed my leadership. And many of my colleagues who work with Excelencia who also feel the same way. So thank you for everything that you guys do in service of accelerating this work. And as I was reflecting as the video is playing and thinking about the conversation, I was thinking about the times when people have asked me a question people often ask leaders, which is what keeps you up at night? And I'll tell you that I, along with my teams, have been through some pretty harrowing emergencies, including the ones we're navigating right now with COVID, but that's not what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is every single student who has passed through the doors of a campus that I have served, who never had the opportunity for their lives and those of their families and communities transformed by walking across that commencement stage to receive a diploma because we failed to make the changes, the systemic changes that we needed to ensure their success. So as I was watching everybody dialogue, it struck me that we have an unstoppable force for good at our fingertips. each other. Leaders across the state and nation who commit to this work every day, our faculty, staff, students, and alumni, our business, industry, government, civic leaders, our philanthropic partners, our chancellors, is really an extraordinary group of people who are working every day to elevate our work, our collective work, really fiercely advocate for deeper investment in Hispanic serving institutions that are demonstrating with data that we are leading the nation in facilitating social and economic mobility and expanding opportunity across an inequitable landscape. And so I was thinking, I certainly don't have all of the answers, but I know that collectively we do. And that's the source of inspiration for me today as we close out this conversation, that we can work together to meet our students where they are, not where we are. And as several of our panelists sort of noted, and perhaps where we've been for decades, but really embrace a deeper understanding of, to Deborah's earlier point, what equity-minded means and what it requires of us. So I just want to thank both of you for your leadership. I want to thank everyone who participated. I want to thank the Matador community who behind the scenes did all of the heavy lifting on the technology. But I do think that in the hardest of times, and many people noted this earlier in the conversation, it is especially important to remember that our work holds the promise of a brighter future. And it doesn't just matter to our communities, it matters to every community. So I'm so delighted to work with all of you in facilitating this work, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Beck. This discussion today is part of Excelencia in Education's larger effort to bring to thought leaders, to practitioners, to activists in the educational enterprise, key information about investments through this thing called Hispanic Serving Institutions, through the emergence of emerging HSIs, and through this idea that by having a common focal point, we will then create an agenda that together we can implement. The use of analysis, the use of evidence-based practices, and the recognition of alignment of purpose across an institution, across a system, are the principles about which we all agree. The one thing that I would add, probably in the echo of what we've just been talking about, is courage. It's always an enterprise, a responsibility. These days, it's particularly challenging to step in, step up, and take responsibility. In our country right now, as we recover from all kinds of impacts, health being the one that dominates everywhere, it does require courage. Courage which has been on display, not only in this conversation, but by all of you who have tuned in. The idea that each of us plays a role with intentionality to learn to serve students, to learn to serve Latino students, and to do it knowing that a country's most precious resource is its human resource, and that education is the means to advance individually, collectively, and within this moment of great challenge. To the Excelencia in Education team that invested in all the work that has been presented and will be presented on social media and throughout our website, mil gracias. To our colleagues at CSUN in particular, who have done quite the heavy lift to make sure everything has come off smoothly. And to echo everything that has been said, we are stronger in each other's company. We are capable because of our common cause. And we are collectively committed to making sure that equity with a Latino lens is accomplished on our watch. Thank you all for sharing your precious time with us for this conversation. And know it's just the beginning. Stay in touch, stay connected. We'll all get it done, serve our students well, And as a result, this country will move through this moment and into brighter days. Thank you for being with us.